to recall what I said earlier about the opportunity to ask some questions, and my hope that we can follow up on some of these observations without getting in the kinds of arguments that we're a little bit too familiar with. So let me give you a chance, and when we have a hand, if you'll please stand up and identify yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
When you're talking about the Asian American population, are you including Indians, the people from India as well?
Yes, Indians today are the third fastest growing group.
I was going to say that because I think that might be a really distinct subgroup within the Asian
They
population.
are a very interesting group, and I'm glad you pointed that out. Indians from India are actually the third largest group of Asians in the United States and very fast growing. They tend to lean Democratic, but they also have a representative in Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, who is a conservative. So it's a really interesting population to look at.
My name is Cynthia Horiguchi. I'm a junior majoring in public relations and political science. And my question is for Professor Roth. I was wondering what you think about Obama's emergence as a celebrity in his own right, and if you think it's fair to if you think that he does have more celebrity than other presidential candidates have in the past, and if so, how has this affected his campaign?
It's a good question, but I would substitute the words. I don't think in the case of Barack Obama, the press has been talking about him as a celebrity, and you're repeating the McCain campaign language. Celebrity. The language I would use for Barack Obama is that he's charismatic. And that what you've had in the course of American politics are very few, but some. And looking out on the room, as the parent of a recent college graduate and a high school junior, I think we're the same cohort. Many of us remember John Kennedy. And if you lived in New York City, as I did growing up, you remember John Lindsay. That there are the occasional people Max Weber talks about as charismatic figures who in fact can revitalize an entire body politic and bureaucracy and inspire people to go into government and serve. So celebrity to me is a kind of shallow term. Charismatic is a much deeper term, and that's how I would, whether you like him or not, that's beside the point. I think he's a very charismatic character.
Art Small, Palo Alto. One thing that struck me in the campaign is nobody's talking healthcare anymore. And I wonder if you could all react to the impression that I have is that if nobody's talking about it now, nobody will have a mandate to do anything about it, and therefore nothing is likely to happen.
Dan?
I think your question, the point of your question is exactly right. You've seen a couple of little flurries back and forth where Obama's campaign has criticized McCain for the aspect of his health care plan that would raise taxes on some taxpayers. And McCain's campaign has responded in kind, talking about the increased government oversight of Obama's plan. But generally speaking, it has not received the kind of attention that it has in elections past, first because of the war in Iraq and more recently because of the broader economic situation. But I think your conclusion is precisely right, because just as we saw an effort to reform Social Security fail in 2005 because it had not been talked about in 2004, and President Bush had failed to build a mandate for that reform, just as we saw a health care reform fail in California last year because neither Governor Schwarzenegger or leading legislative Democrats were able to build a mandate. I think, number one, the lack of political interest, the lack of political conversation on this issue, certainly combined with the lack of financial wherewithal, I think almost dooms any significant effort toward health care reform in the next few years. You're exactly right.
I got a question for the Wall Street Journal. After the town hall debate, a lot of people still complain that they don't hear specifics on the economic crisis. If Obama has Warren Buffett and Robert Rubin advising him, do you think we'll be hearing a more specific detail, which could make a big difference for him?
I don't think so, and I think that's for two reasons. Number one, the format of these debates, but certainly most noticeable in Tuesday night's town hall setting, simply doesn't allow for elongated conversation on any policy matter. For those of you who caught the Saturday Night Live parody last night, where the ersatz Tam Brokaw cut off the candidates after 5 seconds or less, it was only a slight exaggeration from what actually happened on Tuesday. So certainly in that setting, you're not going to hear any more detail. My own opinion, and otherwise what was a very difficult debate for him, I think one of McCain's stronger moments is when he began to talk about his plan for mortgage relief. That said, he talked about it for 95 seconds. and did not bring it up again for the next 88 minutes. And it's awfully difficult for most voters who do not follow this in very close detail to have much of an idea of what he was talking about, let alone whether they think it was a good idea or not. I think Senator Obama and McCain, I think, have both struggled on the bailout. If you move past the differences in tone, and Dana Milbank of the Washington Post had a great line a couple weeks ago. He called this the Goldilocks campaign. One candidate's a little bit too hot, one candidate's a little bit too cold. And if you separate out those tonal differences, you'll notice that what McCain and Obama have been saying about the bailout, at least until Tuesday night, from a substantive basis, have been almost identical. And toward that end, the surrogates, the Buffetts and the Rubins, do take on a disproportionate amount of importance. I think the one thing more than anything that's really driving this discussion in Obama's favor is that when voters, particularly economically insecure voters like the salvageables I was talking about earlier, are feeling dispossessed, the concept of change becomes much, much more alluring to them, particularly from a party that tends to lean a little bit more toward the regulatory than the party that currently holds the White House. Long way of saying, no, probably not much more detail over the next 20-some days.
I was just wondering if any of you could comment on whether we can expect polling place, registration, tabulation irregularities this time around.
I think the answer to that is, do you think everybody reports everything on their IRS form?
The New York Times reported yesterday or the day before half a dozen states in which serious irregularities have already been identified. What struck me is that as much energy as both parties spend pointing fingers at the other, I noted that the governors of those 6 states divided neatly between 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So the same base impulses that Steve is referring to, I think, certainly will affect ballot access and security on Election Day.
Do you think that there are a significant number of people who might otherwise have voted Democratic but won't, or in their minds maybe can't bring themselves to because of Barack Obama's race, and that might tilt the election to John McCain?
I mean, this is not from my own study, but I heard a report on, I guess it was NPR this morning, specifically done among blue-collar workers, labor union members. And it was, it was about a particular activist. I don't recall the gentleman's name. He happens to be an Obama supporter, and he has been actively engaged in trying to speak to various labor unions because he's very much aware. He says, I'm one of the few people that will actually say this, that there are lots of people out there, or anyway, there's a portion of the electorate that can't bring itself to vote for a black man. And so his attempt is to try and discuss in more detail some of Obama's policies, also perhaps to disabuse some people of notions about Obama that are not true. But I think yeah, I think it is an issue. I know from our chairs retreat just before the academic year began, one of our colleagues from the linguistics department was saying that he had been back in New York and was talking to some friends back there, firemen, policemen, and so on, who basically said the same thing. There was no way that they would vote for an African American. So there clearly is a group, but I don't know how large that is, and I'm not a student of domestic politics, so perhaps Dan or Janelle.
Well, I think a recent poll out of Stanford University shows that they calculated that Obama is going to be, his vote is depressed by about 6 percentage points because of race. But it's a complicated story. On the one hand, I wonder sometimes if people's views on race, if it's just talking about that finding, could change the racial dynamics of the campaign since we're so close to the vote now. On the other hand, I find that this is a very kind of unique, not only election because of Barack Obama, but in the way that blackness has been discussed in the campaign, that the kind of stereotypes that have been issued towards Obama have not been the ones that those who study race and politics might think are the usual ones, which is radical, dangerous, angry. That has not really been the dominant stereotype. There's a little bit out there in terms of, do you know him? That's a little, or do we know him? There's a little bit of the, you know, he might be a terrorist, but for the most part, the main stereotype out there is he's elitist and he doesn't understand what regular Americans are going through. And I think that is, in some ways, a refreshing turn. That's not to say that he hasn't been subject and that race will not play a role right up until the day of the campaign, but it's playing out in some unexpected ways.
For those of you who've lived in California for many years, you probably recognize repeated references to the so-called Bradley effect. In 1982, Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley was widely perceived to be the next governor of California and lost instead to the sitting Attorney General, George Deukmejian, for a number of reasons, including vote by mail efforts and initiatives on the ballot, but most predominantly, voters who simply did not tell pollsters the truth. And I think if you take Janelle's figure and look at it from the perspective of a campaign operative, that means that Barack Obama and his campaign need about a 2.5% or 3% margin, to the extent that national polls are relevant, heading into the election in order to protect against this, which I like to say it's better to be a mile outside of hell heading out, which suggests to a significant amount of progress since the early 1980s. Two important points, though, in this regard. Number one is how this is measured, and number two is more importantly, what the Obama campaign is doing about it. First of all, if you ask a voter, if you're a pollster who asks a voter, would you be unwilling to vote for a candidate because of his race or her gender or their religion, most people are going to say, of course I'll vote for them regardless of race or gender or religion because I am an open-minded person. Because for whatever the reason, we feel very strongly that the anonymous voice on the telephone taking the poll thinks well of us. So the way you control for that is twofold. Number one, increasingly, and many of you have probably gotten the phone calls, are these so-called robocalls, where a computer-generated voice asks you the question instead. And curiously, we are not nearly as concerned about what that computer thinks about us. And so, in fact, the response rate on race or gender or religion questions tends to be closer to accurate. The other way, the most accurate way to ask the question is not to say, would you be unwilling to vote for someone because of their race or gender or religion, but rather to say, do you know anybody who would be unwilling to do so? And the unspoken subtext of the answer is, well, of course, I am an open-minded individual, but I know others. And generally, statistical studies have shown that those who happen to know other people who would be unwilling to cast a vote for that reason are guilty of just that bias themselves. More interesting, and I think more important, is what the Obama campaign is doing about this, and Steve referred to this earlier. If the same people who turned out in 2004 were to turn out to vote again on November 4th, every man and woman turned out to vote that had 4 years ago, John McCain would be elected president. And what the Obama campaign has done, as I think most of you know, and they've invested an unprecedented amount of time and energy and money into expanding the electorate among African American voters and among young voters. And knowing that that 2.5% or 3% fall off is going to be something that's going to hit them on election day whether they want it or not, they've essentially been working to build a firewall. It appears, at least to this point successfully, that whatever they lose in terms of the numbers of people who will not vote for an African American, they're going to more than regain from people who would not have voted if not for the efforts of Obama and his campaign.
I want to just add one thing here. What has struck me more than anything else about this campaign and race is Barack Obama is half white and half black. I haven't heard a single person ever refer to him as a mulatto. We don't talk that language. As half white. I remember my wife keeps saying to me, why isn't he bringing his white grandfather, war veteran, out on the campaign trail with him? You know, this is what I would suggest is still, for all the, quote, progress we've made, it's racist America. It goes back to Oscar Micheaux, was the first great African-American filmmaker who made what was called race films, movies in the 19-teens, 20s, through the 40s, for African-American audiences who were either not allowed into white movie theaters, period. They were white, they were movie theaters, or they could only go at midnight for what were called midnight rambles. And one of the key themes, in this is 1918 on, was one drop of black blood makes you black in America.
If I could just add one quick thing, and that is just to build on something that Janelle said about the sort of exotic notion of Obama, and that is that I think for the first time, and because we have somebody who has the middle name of Hussein running for president, that there has been an attempt to play on American fears and also to generate further fears of Muslims. And I think that really is unprecedented, and a campaign, the origins of which are still rather unclear, but there's a DVD of a very inflammatory movie that was made, that was sent out and was accepted as to be included in newspapers distributed around the country. Something like 80 different newspapers accepted it. It is racist if you substitute it for Muslim. Virtually any other ethnic group in the United States, I'm sure these newspapers would have had absolutely no qualms about turning down sending it around with their circulation, but in this particular case they didn't. They did accept it, and I think it does say something about another way of trying to get at Barack Obama, and also something about other fears and other prejudices that we really have to deal with in this country.
I wanted to follow up sort of the same question, but with immigrants, because I'm wondering about Hispanics and Asians, specifically with race, and also intergenerational, the older, maybe first generation, and then the second generation, younger generation, that how they split on race.
So what we saw was in the primaries, Asian American and Latino Republicans were mainly throwing their support behind McCain, and except in Florida, Latinos were supporting Romney. In the Democratic primary, and this fueled a lot of similar questions, Latinos and Asian Americans 2-to-1 went for Hillary over Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton over Barack Obama, and there was a lot of speculation that maybe Latinos and Asian Americans would not be tolerating a black candidate, and that's because a lot of attitudinal surveys say that Asian Americans and Latinos some of them do hold racist attitudes, but what we did see in later polling is that both of those groups are much more solidly behind Obama now as a group, not even just the Democrats, than McCain. And so that's some evidence that that doesn't mean that race isn't playing out in those communities in ways that disadvantage Obama, but that for the most part, it's not a barrier to him getting a solid chunk, a plurality of those votes, and the rest are undecided.
My question is about perhaps international values. For some odd coincidence, I've been out of the country in various third world countries for the last 3 elections, and I will be again in India on election day. And I've had some interesting reactions over the years, all of them very intense. But I have heard a report on NPR recently that there is a great deal of indifference in the international community about who wins this election, because what's going on in the United States is such a negative vibe. They blame us for so much of what's going on, of the trouble in their own countries, that it no longer really matters to them who's president of the United States. Is that something that you've detected in your studies?
That is completely different from what my perception is. Now, I haven't spent a great deal of time overseas in this since this campaign began, but certainly from my reading of papers from various areas, I would say certainly from the Middle East, and also I follow some European papers, French papers, Spanish papers, and so on. I think there's a great deal of interest. I know I've seen polls from France where 80% of people they say they would vote for Obama. Of course, one doesn't know what they would actually vote for an African Frenchman if he were running for president, but that's another matter. Anyway, so no, and my sense is there has been a lot of discussion in the Middle East, and interestingly enough, ladies and gentlemen, most Middle Easterners don't even know about Barack Obama's middle name. The fact that the people here seem to think, or some people think he's Muslim, to Middle Easterners is a complete surprise. They don't really know about that. And there are differences of opinion. One will find in some of the more conservative states that are concerned more about sort of the U.S. military relationship, say in the Gulf and so on, there is more support for McCain. In other areas that have maybe seen more violence visited upon them by the United States or its allies, there's certainly a desire for a change and a move for a Democrat. So but I think there's a lot of interest.
There's actually quite a bit of polling done by the Pew Institute on this that shows, with the exception of some of the Eastern European former Soviet bloc countries, which do lean to some degree toward McCain, Obama enjoys a great deal of support and interest in most other corners around the world. What's interesting to me is how much of this seems to be directed at George Bush, and as much as McCain would like to avoid the designation, his heir apparent personally rather than ideologically. Because, of course, at the same time that we're seeing Merkel and Sarkozy and the likely ascension of the Tories in Great Britain, the animus, not necessarily toward a particular ideology, but toward this particular administration, seems to be driving those poll numbers more than anything else.
Yeah, my own, no poll, but anecdotally, traveling last year in Spain, France, and Ireland, the cabbie vote. But it's interesting, the cabbie vote was very excited about the election. I had a cabbie in Paris who kept saying, un noir président aux États-Unis, jamais, jamais, jamais. A black president in America, never. And they were for Hillary. They really wanted Hillary in the primaries because they loved the Clintons, but they wanted, it's what Dan's saying, Laurie's saying, it's anybody but Bush in Europe. That's what it is. Anybody but Bush is welcome.
So we've accomplished at least 3 things other than learning that French cabbies supported Hillary. One is that we've had an almost hour-long conversation about the election, and we haven't talked about Governor Palin, which I think suggests that there are, it's not that that would be a bad thing, but there are plenty of interesting things to think about when you dig into an event like this. We have also demonstrated, I think, I hope, that the most interesting conversations at USC happen in the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Thank you very much. And I hope that you parents have a sense of how lucky our students are to have such extraordinary faculty. And so if you'll please join me in thanking our faculty, and thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you so much.